April 29th, 1945. A Sunday. The war in Europe was almost over. Berlin was collapsing. Hitler would be dead within 48 hours. To many soldiers, this felt like the end. But for the men approaching Dachau that morning, it would feel like something else entirely. The sky over southern Germany was gray and low. The air was cold. Snow still clung to the ground in patches that refused to melt. Moving along the road toward a large walled complex near Munich were soldiers of the 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds. They had fought their way across Europe, Italy, France, the Rhineland. They were veterans, hardened, exhausted. Their intelligence briefing was vague. The complex ahead was believed to be a supply depot, possibly a factory, maybe a prison. Nothing unusual, nothing urgent. They were wrong. As they advanced, they reached a railroad track just outside the compound. On it sat a train. 39 cattle cars, silent, motionless. At first glance, it looked abandoned. Just another rail line clogged by the chaos of a collapsing Reich. Then the smell hit them. A thick, sweet, rotten odor that didn't belong to machinery or fuel. Something organic, something final. A lieutenant stepped closer. He climbed up and slid the door of one car open. And he screamed. Inside were bodies. Thousands of them. Men, women, children, naked or wrapped in rags, starved, beaten, crushed together, stacked like discarded cargo. Many had died standing up, held in place by the sheer density of human flesh. They had been left there for days. No water, no food, no air. Some bodies showed bite marks. The living had tried to eat the dead. This was not combat. This was extermination. The American soldiers froze. They had seen death before. Violent, sudden, explosive death. Friends torn apart by artillery. Bodies scattered across fields. But this was different. One soldier, 19 years old, from Oklahoma, sat down in the snow and began to cry. He couldn't stop. Another turned away and vomited. For most of them, shock lasted only seconds. Then something else took over. Rage. Cold. Focused. Uncontrolled. They looked toward the SS. Watchtowers rising behind the walls of the camp. They tightened their grips on their rifles. In that moment, the rules of war dissolved. Not slowly. Instantly. This is the true story of the Dachau liberation reprisals. The day American soldiers snapped. The day prisoners were executed. And the day senior commanders quietly decided that no one would be punished. Before Dachau, the men of the 45th Infantry Division had a reputation. They were disciplined, professional. They took prisoners. They followed orders. They were not killers by instinct. They were farm boys, factory workers, students, men who expected to go home and forget the war. Dachau changed that in minutes. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks was the senior officer on the ground. He sensed the danger immediately, not from the Germans, but from his own men. "Keep moving," he shouted. Don't look at the train, but it was impossible not to look. There were approximately 2,300 bodies inside those cars. Eyes open, mouths frozen, faces reduced to bone. The soldiers walked past them in silence. Every step deeper into the camp tightened the pressure. Private John Lee would later say, "We were mad. So mad we wanted to kill every German in the world." When they reached the main gate, the camp was still functioning. The SS commandant, Martin Weiss, had already fled. But he left behind nearly 500 SS personnel and a young officer named Heinrich Wicker. Wicker knew the war was over. He understood what surrender was supposed to look like. He put on his best uniform. He polished his boots. He stepped forward carrying a white flag. He expected formality, respect, the conventions of civilized war. He approached the Americans and declared, "I surrender this camp to the United States Army." An American officer stared at him. then looked past him, at the death train. He spit in Wicker's face. The surrender was over before it began. Inside the camp, chaos erupted. The prisoners saw American uniforms and rushed the fences. 30,000 survivors, skeletons wrapped in skin, screaming, crying, collapsing. Americans! Americans! But while the prisoners celebrated, the soldiers were hunting. Near a coal yard inside the camp, a group of SS guards attempted to surrender. They raised their hands. They shouted phrases they believed would save them. Hitler kaputt. Hitler is finished. It didn't matter. Watching them was an American lieutenant, widely believed to be Jack Bushyhead, a Native American officer from Oklahoma. Moments earlier, he had seen the crematorium. The ovens were still warm. Ash still inside. He didn't shout an order. He didn't need to. He gestured with his Thompson submachine gun. The Germans were confused, but compliant. Around 50 SS men lined up against a brick wall. Some began to panic. Geneva Convention. Juan shouted. A machine gunner known as Birdeye set up his .30 caliber machine gun. Metal clacked. A belt slid into place. He looked at the lieutenant. The lieutenant nodded. The gun opened fire. 10 seconds. Maybe less. When the smoke cleared, the SS guards were on the ground. Most dead, some still moving. The snow was black with coal dust and red with blood. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks heard the gunfire and ran toward it. He saw his men firing into the pile. He drew his pistol and fired into the air. "Stop it!" "What the hell are you doing?" The gunner looked at him. His eyes were empty. He was crying they deserved it. He said, "This was not an isolated incident. At Tower B, SS guards attempted to surrender. They climbed down ladders with their hands raised. They were shot before they reached the ground. Their bodies fell into the moat. American soldiers stepped to the edge and fired into the water to make sure none survived. One GI later wrote home, it wasn't war, it was an execution. And I didn't feel a thing. But the Americans were not the only ones seeking blood. The prisoners wanted revenge. Somehow, they escaped the barracks, weak, starving, barely able to stand, but fueled by adrenaline. They found an SS guard hiding in a watchtower. They dragged him down. They had no guns. They used shovels, sticks, hands. American soldiers watched, smoking, silent. An officer asked, "Should we stop them?" A sergeant answered, "No, let them finish." The guard was beaten to death. In another part of the camp, prisoners found a German capo, a prisoner who had worked for the SS, enforcing brutality. They drowned him in a latrine. For roughly 1 hour, Dachau became lawless. Victims became judges. Judges became executioners. And the U.S. Army looked away. Eventually, order returned. Colonel Sparks intervened. He locked surviving German personnel away, not to punish them, but to protect them from his own men. But the damage was done. Photos had been taken. Days later, an investigative team arrived, led by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker. They interviewed witnesses, collected photographs, documented evidence. The report was clear. American soldiers had violated international law. Prisoners had been executed. Surrender had been ignored. Court-martials were recommended. The report moved up the chain of command until it reached the desk of George S. Patton. Patton was known for discipline. He punished soldiers for unpolished boots, for sloppy behavior. But this was different. He studied the photographs. Ses bodies the Dane. He summoned the investigating officer. "What is this garbage?" asked. "Sir," the officer replied, "it is evidence of war crimes." Patton threw the report onto his desk. War crimes. He said, "You walk into a place like that. see 2,000 dead bodies on a train, and you expect my boys to follow the rule book. According to accounts, Patton said the men were overwrought, that their trigger fingers were nervous. That such things happened in war. He refused to sign the court-martial orders. What happened next depends on the source. Some say Patton burned the report. Others say he ordered it buried deep within classified archives. Either way, the result was the same: no trials, no punishment. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, agreed. He had seen the photographs himself. He understood what prosecuting American liberators would mean politically, morally, psychologically. The investigation was quietly quashed. The case was closed. Lieutenant Jack Bushyhead returned to Oklahoma. He never spoke publicly about Dachau. He died in 1977. The reprisals at Dachau remain controversial. Extremists point to them and say, "See, the Americans were just as bad." Historians disagree. This was not genocide. It was not policy. It was a psychological collapse triggered by exposure to industrialized evil. A moment when discipline broke under moral overload. Today, Dachau is a memorial. 30,000 victims are honored. The SS guards executed against the wall have no marker. Their graves are unmarked, their names forgotten. History judged them. They built hell. On April 29, 1945, they faced men who had just seen it, and the hardest question remains. If you had opened that boxcar, if you had smelled the train, if you had seen the oven still warm, would you have pulled the trigger? That is the question Dachau leaves behind.